Good evening. On behalf of the Islesboro Forum Committee, welcome to the fourth program of the 2022 Islesboro Forum Speaker Series. Thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Gail Jackson and the moderator for today's program. This is our 30th year of presenting distinguished speakers to the island community. Our program tonight is exclusively in person. However, we will record the program and post it several days after the program at both the Islesboro Forum website and on YouTube. So if you have friends who you think would enjoy this, you can tell them that they have that option. In a couple of days it will be posted. Please check out our website at islesboroforum.org for a preview of the rest of the summer's programs. And before we introduce our speaker, I also want to acknowledge and thank the 7 members of the Islesboro Forum Committee, without whom our programs would not take place. They come up with terrific speaker ideas and sponsor speakers in a very, very helpful way. I have to give a special shout out to our technical producer, Michael Hutcherson. Whenever I mention his name, applause. Seems to break out. We all know that so many things are facilitated and helped by his technical proficiency. So thank you, Michael. Please consider making a donation to the forum. Our costs for 6 programs will be about $1,500. When we hope you will want to make a donation in this dear little basket. How can you resist? There. Our format tonight will be to hear remarks from our speaker, Ken Hinman, on marine conservation as practiced by Wild Oceans, and then for him to take questions from the audience. Following the formal program, all attendees are invited to join the speaker at the parking lot across from ICC, where there will be an authentic Oklahoma barbecue. Quite a treat, sponsored by Peter Truslow, Tim Choate, and Stephanie Choate Oppenheimer. So thank you to those 3 for doing this, and please join us afterwards. Now I will ask Peter Truslow to introduce our speaker, as he has been deeply involved with Wild Oceans himself and its mission, and has known Ken Hinman for many years. So Peter, could I ask you to introduce Ken? Thank you.
Hi, and thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. No fish on the menu tonight. We're going to talk about good things about the fish, and I'm really happy to be able to introduce to you Ken Hinman. I've worked with Ken for several years on the board of Wild Oceans, and with Stephanie, we are co-chairs now of Wild Oceans. And Ken and Tim Choate, who Tim is in the back, are really pioneers in marine conservation. Our organization was really the first marine conservation organization, and now there's so many, and they're all great, well, mostly great, but we were there at the first, and Ken will talk about what that means and how we fit in the space of marine conservation. So Ken has been doing this for many years, and he's going to bring to you an angle you may not have heard about. He'll talk about the things we hear about every day, but with a historical perspective. So he's had over 40 years experience working professionally to conserve marine fish. The focus started really on the large pelagic fish, the tuna, the marlin, that type of thing, and how do we protect those fish from longlining and all of that, and then became focused on ecosystems and global warming and those types of things, and he'll talk about that. So he was actually the president of Wild Oceans from 1997 to 2019. He's authored hundreds of published articles on marine conservation policy, education, and science. He wrote monthly conservation columns for Marlin Magazine and Saltwater Sportsman. He served in a number of appointed advisory positions on fisheries matters, national and international. Among the individual awards he has received are the Billfish Foundation's Conservation Award in 1988, the Carl Sullivan Fishery Conservation Award by the American Fisheries Society in 2002, and he was inducted just this last year into the IGFA Hall of Fame. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you, Peter, and welcome to everybody. I'm glad you all came. It's a good group. I'm really happy about that. I first want to thank Tim Choate and Stephanie Choate-Oppheimer for hosting this event, both here and across the street after I'm through, and Peter Truslow, of course, for helping make this event happen. And I do want to express my appreciation to the community of Islesboro for giving me the chance to come back to Maine in the summertime. When I was a kid, my family rented cabins in the Maine woods every other summer on Rangeley Lake, on Moosehead Lake, on Lovewell Pond. And I have many, many wonderful memories of those summers. And when I was about this age, and yes, that's me, and if you're wondering how I got into the IGFA Fishing Hall of Fame, there you go, you got it right there. One summer I was about this age, my father taught my brother and I how to fish. And we were fishing off the end of our dock in front of our cabin. I'm not sure which lake it was. And you could see the fish down there swimming around. And there was one that was larger than the others, down deeper than the others, but we could see him because he had a grayish head. And we named him the Gray Ghost. And my brother and I were determined that summer that we were going to catch him. And after about a week of frustration in failing to catch him, we were still too young to realize that even the best fishermen fail most of the time. We decided and we agreed among ourselves that when we did catch him, we would let him go. Now, on one level, there's a kid this age within a week who went through the entire Edward Hewitt's Evolution of a Master Angler in 1 week. And that is basically you start trying to catch as many fish as possible, then the largest fish, then the most difficult, and then you catch them to release them. I have to give away that we never caught the Gray Ghost. But I look back on that summer and realize that this was really my first lesson in conservation. It was respect for a wild creature. And I start with that story because respect for nature and for all its creatures is really the foundation of all conservation. And I think the earliest age you learn that, the better. And I'm going to return to that subject at the very end of the talk. Now, an early mentor of mine, Hal Lyman, who was the publisher of Saltwater Sportsman, a magazine I wrote for many years, he told me that if you want people to care about what you care about, don't just give them facts, tell stories. So I want to tell some stories about my own journey, so you know where I'm coming from, about Wild Oceans, what it's about and how it gets things done, and about the evolution of marine fish conservation in America. And in fact, these three stories are entwined and begin together in the 1970s, as you'll see. And I'll end with some stories that are still being written about future challenges that we all face. Some may be more daunting than we've ever faced in the past. Now, Wild Oceans was born as the National Coalition for Marine Conservation, or NCMC, in 1973 in the lovely coastal city of Savannah, Georgia. I arrived there 5 years later with a girlfriend, 2 dogs, and a VW Bug. In other words, everything a young man needs except a job. And that girlfriend, I should say, is my wife of 44 years, so that worked out well too. I was lucky enough to become NCMC's first paid employee. Now, the NCMC, as Peter mentioned, was the first marine conservation organization focused on fish, certainly at a national level. where the spotlight was always on the charismatic megafauna up to that point, the whales, the dolphins, the sea turtles, and there's nothing wrong with that. But I soon understood that MCMC's focus on fish and fishing was not only unique, but that it forced us to understand and define our intimate relationship with the ocean and all of its creatures. Because when we fish, we join the ocean world as an interdependent part of it. And how we fish, how we envision the future of fishing, really, I think, will determine the future of not only fishing, but of the ocean and its ability to sustain us. Now, because of my love of books and writing on the one hand, and of nature and outdoors on the other, I jumped back and forth between majoring in English literature at Gettysburg College and wildlife management at the University of New Hampshire. And in between jumps, I worked at the Park Commission in New Jersey. And I finally ended up with a Bachelor of Science degree in environmental conservation. Now, a century ago, Teddy Roosevelt wisely noted that while the profession of the modern naturalist is more and more a science, it is also becoming more and more an art. And I think that is even truer today. Science alone cannot teach us what we need to know most about nature, and that is how to value it. So this science and liberal arts combination, I think, really, it taught me critical thinking. It taught me to see the big picture. It taught me that how to come at problems from a different angle. And most of all, it taught me how to focus on how humankind fits into the natural world. And that's really been at the crux of, I think, all conservation issues, is where do we fit and how do we fit? And of course, I'd read Aldo Leopold, but I still didn't have a word really to define this feeling of finding ways to live in harmony with nature until I read David Western's book, In the Dust of Kilimanjaro, his seminal book on preserving African wildlife. And David wrote, "If we take the narrow view that nature is harmonious unless disturbed by humanity, and that protected areas are necessary to ensure the survival of wildlife, then there can be no hope for wildlife outside of parks. Take the broader view of nature in continual flux and humans as part of it, and there's far more space for wildlife if we can rediscover the art of coexistence." I underline that, rediscover the art of coexistence. And really, that's become my philosophy, and it's best summed up with the observation by novelist W. Somerset Maugham that the study of ethics is part and parcel of the study of nature. For man must learn his place in the world before he can act rightly and reasonably. And after 4.5 decades as a conservationist, I've learned that acting rightly when we fish or interact with the sea in any way means cooperating with nature's processes and yielding to her limits. It's coexistence, and it's really the only way. Now I'm going to tell 4 short stories of New England fish stories. I think they make some points about some of the issues we've faced and how Wild Oceans gets things done. And the reason I tell these stories is to show that change does occur. That the Wild Oceans track record makes this clear on this and many other issues. But there's no escaping the fact that there's hard work, a lot of hard work. The fishery management process is really a tough one to navigate. You have to attend literally dozens and dozens and dozens of meetings and workshops before an action is taken if you really want to affect that decision. You've got to be there in the trenches, working to influence decisions at every level, and meanwhile earning the respect of the fishery managers and policymakers because of the fact you're there working the system. And sometimes it means changing laws in Congress, but that's difficult. but it can be done. But even then, you have to get involved to make sure that it's implemented properly. So the work really never stops. But when one path is blocked, you find another path. You build alliances, and you always keep the ball moving forward. And that's really been our MO, if you want to put it that way. And each of these things I'm going to describe demonstrates that identifying a problem, the chain of events that led to the solution, and how that solution not just was benefiting that particular fish or fishery, but also many others. Okay, New England groundfish, the beginning and the end of overfishing with a question mark. My timing in coming to work at the NCMC was pretty good. It really couldn't have been better in 1978. I was there really at the birth of marine fish conservation in America, and I was part of a group that helped midwife it. In 1976, Congress passed what became the Magnuson Act, which was established a 200-mile fishery conservation zone around the United States and set up 8 regional councils to manage our fisheries. So the first fishery management plan that I worked on was also the first fishery management plan, which was for New England groundfish, initiated in 1977. Now, as New Englanders, many of you may be familiar with the story that years of heavy foreign fishing, foreign trawling off our shores in the 60s and 70s had depleted stocks of cod, flounder, and haddock, and other groundfish. And this was a primary impetus for passing the Magnuson Act in the beginning. After that, the foreign trawlers were excluded. Stocks over the next several years started to rebound, and the U.S. fishery grew to exploit those stocks for the domestic market. All good, it would seem. But unfortunately, because there were no constraints on the fishery for more than a decade, no real effective restraints, that light at the end of the tunnel that we saw really turned out to be a runaway train heading straight for us. And this is what happened again, the second collapse. For the next decade or more, New England struggled to manage the fishery. They were stubbornly resisting put quotas and limits on effort in favor of more indirect means of mesh sizes and things like that in the nets. And the result was this. Neither the council nor the law was really prepared for this kind of regulating overfishing. We'd put a law in place to manage our fisheries, thinking that, well, when we got rid of the foreigners, everything would be fine. And we had a system in place, but it really had no accountability, no really means, prescriptions for how we were going to manage this thing. And to borrow a phrase or analogy from Samuel Butler, it's like learning to play the violin while at the same time you have to give concerts. And the intent would be laudable, but the performance would be terrible. And that's really what happened. And it wasn't just cod and flounder in New England over these years. By 1992, 67 fish stocks in the United States were declared overfished. But it was the unremitting futility of managing groundfish and controlling that fishery and keeping it at a healthy level because of its history in marine fish conservation in America that really stood out. And to me, it really called back the last line of another American tragedy, the Great Gatsby, which is, so we beat on boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past. And that's really the position we were in with that stock and with a lot of our fisheries in 1992. So here's part of the story that you probably don't know. And it's NCMC Wild Ocean's role. In 1993, we held a national symposium on the Magnuson Act in New Orleans, a 3-day symposium, to look at all the problems with the Magnuson Act and to suggest some remedies. And it was about 150 people there, scientists, academics, government people, fishermen. And we published the proceedings as Conserving America's Fisheries. Now, later that year, we formed the Marine Fish Conservation Network. And that network's sole purpose was to strengthen the Magnuson Act in the 1995-96 reauthorization. And we established a national agenda which dealt with overfishing, it dealt with bycatch, it dealt with habitat, dealt with representation on the councils, a lot of issues, and sought organizations, local, regional, national, to sign on to that agenda and to be part of the network and to make these changes happen. And we ended up with over 100 members, organizations belonging to the network. And over the next 2 and 3 years, testifying in Congress, working with staff and members of Congress, we got legislation into the Congress that was passed in 1996, the Sustainable Fisheries Act, which was really amendments to the Magnuson Act. And those amendments put into place something that was recommended at that 1993 symposium. And that was that it would require any fishery that was declared to be overfished, you would have to define overfishing, you would have to define a rebuilding target, you would have to set a rebuilding timetable for getting there, and it had to be in 10 years or less. Now, as a result, I think that number I gave you of 6 was cut in half in short time of number of overfished species. Over the next few years, some were added to that list, some were more removed. The next reauthorization, more measures were brought in to make sure that that stick. But right now, it's been successful enough that 84% of our stocks are considered not overfished, healthy. And that's a big change for what we were dealing with for decades in the United States. And the important point here is that the New England fisheries really were the impetus on both ends of the beginning and the end of overfishing. And I don't think we could have done either without them, but it was a tough road. The next story is swordfish, back to the future of fishing. And a lot of people think that fish in our original logo is a marlin, billfish, but it's a swordfish. And it was selected because it's a wild creature that's as magnificent as any animal on Earth. There are few fish bigger or faster in the ocean. It's a fish of both commercial and recreational value. It's a fish that was threatened by pollution. Remember, the fishery was shut down in the 70s because of high mercury contents. It's a highly migratory fish. It traverses thousands of miles of the ocean, which brings in all the high seas and international issues into the equation. It's a keystone predator. It's vital to maintaining a balance and diversity in marine ecosystems. And perhaps most critical to its survival and to other big fish is that it's primarily taken by pelagic longlines. And that's where our story is here. NCMC co-founder Chris Weld from Boston, he used to tell us stories about fishing for swordfish on the Nantucket Shoals and Georges Bank back in the 60s. And he described it as more hunting than fishing. You had to sight the fish finning at the surface, you had to present the bait to him, you had to try to get him to take him. And he described him as a thinking opponent, that they were extremely hard to find. But there were a lot of anglers like that who considered swordfish one of the most challenging fish out there. And they and the harpooners, who had been the primary commercial fishermen sustainably since the early 1900s, they kept that memory of what swordfish fishery had been and could be again during the time that it collapsed in the 1970s and 80s because of the advent of longlining. Now, longlining, there's the broadbill. That's a short line, but people don't really believe it, but these can be up to 40 or more miles long, the main line, with hundreds and sometimes thousands of baited hooks hanging in the water column. And it's completely non-selective in the sense that any animal with a mouth big enough to take the baited hook gets hooked. And it's the target is swordfish in many cases, sometimes tuna, but in all cases there's a large collateral damage of other species that are the accidental or unintended victims. And longlining is a method of fishing that really can't be controlled by setting limits or quotas on what you can catch of different species, because really it just turns what would be landed into something that is discarded at sea. It really doesn't solve the problem. you really have to get at the problem by determining where and when and to what vulnerable or protected species the most damage is being done, and then close those areas at those times. And the chain of event that really brought about taming longlining in the United States began with that 1993 reauthorization, where we got a mandate, a national mandate that required all fishery management plans to minimize bycatch. Subsequently, the National Marine Fisheries Service amended their swordfish plan to abide by that. We sued the agency in 1999, believing that what they proposed was not effective. It really was projected to reduce bycatch by about 5%. And they ended up settling out of court and closing large areas. And that the areas they closed, we didn't just go with them and say, solve this bycatch problem. We spent 2 years putting together this report, Ocean Roulette, and submitted it to them during their amending of the fishery management plan. And it looked at every option for addressing longline bycatch and reducing it. And we recommended specific time and area closures in that report to the National Marine Fisheries Service. And the ones that were adopted during that settlement mirror the closures that were recommended in that report. It's the ones in green, the ones in yellow have subsequently been implemented for bluefin tuna, but the ones in green, there are 133,000 square miles were a result of that settlement. And it's estimated that those closures reduced bycatch of marlin and sailfish by 60 to 70%. This is in total bycatch in all U.S. waters. Sharks by over 40%, and sea turtles by 70%. So it's been very, very effective. And they are still in effect. They are challenged almost on a biannual basis by longline industry that wants to get back into those areas. But they are areas of high juvenile swordfish, they're nursery areas. They played a big part in helping rebuild swordfish in the Atlantic. And I know this gentleman from SeaWeb here, and we worked with SeaWeb back in those days too on the Give Swordfish a Break campaign. We know that you just don't define the good by the absence of the bad. And since this time, we've worked to try to find more sustainable ways of fishing so that sword fishermen can continue to fish. And off Florida, they use buoy gear. To catch swordfish with no bycatch. I won't get into describing the gear, but it's very clean. And we've got them to introduce it off the West Coast as an alternative to drift nets out there for swordfish. And so, we know that the future of fishing is not defined by what unsustainable practices we leave in the past, but the ones we adopt to replace them. And lastly, although this story has been about swordfish, bycatch reduction mandate put in place has been effective in minimizing bycatch in fisheries all over the country, a lot of net fisheries, trawl fisheries, and others. So that's had a large benefit nationwide. Now, striped bass. A few days ago, actually, I heard this business motivational speaker, and I usually don't get my motivation from those guys, but this guy said that, I think he said that success creates a whole new set of problems, but that you should welcome them because it means you are on the right track. And while I was puzzling over that, I thought, yeah, striped bass. It's one of the most iconic fish in New England, and along most of the East Coast, really. Striped bass is, and we know it as rockfish down where I live in Virginia. And it's generally thought of as the greatest fish comeback story of all time. I had to get this in there because this is my wife's Uncle Paul, proudly displaying. And striper fishermen are zealots. I mean, they love their fish, they love their sport, and they will do anything to protect it. When I started out, striped bass were in the midst of a collapse in the late 70s. And one of my first projects was we put together a symposium on striped bass in Boston in 1980. And that was to look at the causes of the decline, which really was overfishing, which in turn made striped bass more vulnerable to pollution and water quality problems, especially in Chesapeake Bay, which is their main spawning area, and spawning success was deteriorating. Following that symposium, we were involved in the first interstate management plan. That's for the 15 states on the East Coast, 1981. Getting compliance with all the states was very difficult, and with the help of Jerry Studs from Massachusetts, the Striped Bass Conservation Act was passed in '84, which really gave a federal hammer to the interstate efforts, so that if you didn't go along with the agreed upon interstate plan, your state, the federal government, could close your fishery down, which didn't ever happen because that's a very strong incentive to go along. And in 1985, the state of Maryland closed Chesapeake Bay completely to fishing for striper. Delaware did the same thing in Delaware Bay. Virginia joined the moratorium in the bay later on. So by 1990, striped bass came roaring back. And it was that lesson that if you leave the fish alone for a while, they will come back. And fishermen learned that lesson. But they also learned that they sacrificed a lot. They gave up a lot during that time. And they have sort of this white knuckle grip on the future of striped bass every time there's a threat to it, whether it's even coming from their own community or from outside. And that leads into the next story, which is, there's Chesapeake Bay, and that's just one of the numbers. I promise I wouldn't give you too many of. 75% of East Coast striped bass are spawned in the bay. Now to Menhaden, conservation of fish world. The resounding success in rebuilding striped bass along the Atlantic coast was followed by worries that there were not enough prey to support a resurgent striped bass population. You have to understand that in the 90s, all of a sudden there were striped bass in the bay and along the coast that we hadn't seen since the early 70s. And during that interim time, while the striped bass were away, the harvest of Menhaden continued. I think it went up exponentially. And fishing concentrated over that time in Chesapeake Bay, which is really the worst place that it could be concentrated. Now, leading into this story, there's the chart of Menhaden abundance, and you can see that by mid-1990s, it was quite low, and that's when the resurgent striped bass population came back. Now, all these fish are omnivorous, but Menhaden is the #1 fish in the diet of striped bass, especially while they're in the bay. And eating other things just puts them at competition with other fish like bluefish and weakfish, and you get that whole ripple effect. So there's not an answer of they'll just eat something else. They needed the Menhaden. Now, as it happened, in 1997, I was appointed as the conservation representative to the Ecosystem Principles Advisory Panel. This also came out of the 1996 Magnuson Act reauthorization to put together this panel to look at how ecosystem principles are being implemented, if at all, in the United States by fishery management councils in our plans, and also to recommend what they should do to implement them. And to me, on that panel, as somebody who had worked, there were a lot of academics and scientists on there with a lot of good ideas about ecosystem principles. But me, as somebody who worked with the councils, knew that we really needed something that they could get their teeth in right away and start working on. And not just have, yes, someday we'll all be doing this wonderful thing of ecosystem management. And that was to get this statement out of there that the initial step would be considering predator-prey relationships in existing fishery management plans. That report went to Congress in 1999. Right after that report was put out, NCMC held this workshop in the Chesapeake Bay area. And it was looking at, okay, how do we actually take this next step to manage predator-prey relationships? And we used striped bass and Menhaden as a case study at the time. Now, our early focus had been on Chesapeake Bay because the bay, it's not only the striper's main breeding ground, but the harvest of menhaden had been concentrated in there for about a decade, and that the bass in the bay were exhibiting all these signs of environmental stress. You really had to be there to see it. Fish were skinny, they had lesions on them. The natural mortality was rather high, and striper fishermen really feared that what they had worked so hard to get to return was being jeopardized by menhaden not being in the bay. Now, menhaden were managed by that same interstate agency that managed striped bass, but they had done nothing. There were no limits on the menhaden harvest whatsoever. And so what we did, and this was rather, it was taken as rather radical at the time, but we put out a petition to close the bay to all menhaden harvest completely. And we went around to, this is not a digital petition. This is getting people to actually sign their name and address on something, going to tackle shops and the docks and fishing tournaments and all over. And we got over 5,000 signatures that way. And our intent, everybody thought, well, this is just a radical group that wants to just shut down our fishery and all that stuff. What we did is it got the attention of the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission in 2003, that fall, at their annual meeting. I was invited to present our petition, probably expecting that, they can easily dismiss it. And I had worked with the ASMFC since 1981, the striped bass thing. I knew a lot of the people, and I had their respect. So what I did was present them with a 9-page paper recommending how they could amend their menhaden plan to address these issues. It was not at all about shutting down the fishery. It was about how they can put what they can put into place so that we'll make sure that their menhaden fishery continues, but that it leaves enough fish in the water for striped bass. And that really, it worked. They sent the report to their technical committee. It resulted in a scientific workshop studying localized depletion in Chesapeake Bay, and they concluded that was highly likely there was. After that, we joined with, this is just part of our public awareness campaign. We had this artwork done here for that. We started an organization called Menhaden Matter, and that was with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Coastal Conservation Association, and Environmental Defense Fund. And the goal of this group was to put a cap on the catch in Chesapeake Bay until an ecological catch limits were set, which might take some time, which did take some time. And we were successful, and Menhaden Matter became a Menhaden coalition that, again, had dozens and dozens and dozens of groups belonging to it. And we had to go, again, put together technical papers, go to all these workshops and everything to try to get this in place. And in 2006, final action was taken. A cap was put on the catch in Chesapeake Bay, slightly lower than recent years. And we began work then on trying to figure out how do you set a catch for a forage fish. And this is where it broadens just beyond menhaden, because there are forage fish all over the country, sea herring up here, river herring, shad, Pacific sardine, there's squid, mackerel, butterfish, all that are all very important forage fish, none of whom were being managed in any way to take account of their role in the ecosystem or how much we were leaving in the water for predators. So we started researching these and putting reports. And really, the basic, again, the MO is not just to go there and bang on their door and say, you got to address this, you got to do something about this. It was, we're going to offer you a way to do it. And, if you don't like that, find another way. But it really jump-starts the whole process. Taking the bait, which was about 2006, I think, that analyzed all those FMPs for the main forage fish in the United States, how much they were taking into account, what they needed to do to amend those plans to address ecosystem issues, also in their stock assessments and all that. And that was more of a technical thing to take to to the councils, but also to NGOs. And Pam Lyons-Groman, who was the key author of that report, our executive director, Pam and I toured all over the country for about a year, making this presentation to the councils and any organizations that we could. And we followed that with this Preserving the Northeast Forage Base, which was really aimed at both the New England and Mid-Atlantic councils. And that was for other NGOs. It was showing them the process and opportunities of how they could get involved in protecting forage fish. And the reason we did that was because people had taken notice that this was not only an important issue, it was a first step into ecosystem-based fishery management, but that also it was getting a lot of attention from the public. It just seemed like, and from fishermen, it seems like a natural thing. You know, fish got to eat fish. You got to have enough for them to eat. And so a lot of organizations were wanting to get involved in this. So we did that, and a lot of organizations to this day are involved in that. And so today, the role of Atlantic Menhaden, oh, I left out one, my favorite one, which was resource sharing, which is really a culmination of all of our research into ecological reference points. That's the most technical jargon I will give you tonight. But that's really, reference points are just the targets you're aiming for, target population level, and the threshold that you're aiming to avoid. And these are set in an ecological context, not just the health of the species, but the health of the associated species and the ecosystem. And we researched, oh gosh, we have about 100 citations from the literature in there, and we found a consensus internationally on leaving 75% of an unfished population in the water to benefit, to have the broadest benefit for a wide array of predators. And this was as an alternative to trying to build models that would assess the needs of, you know, literally numerous predators whose populations are changing all the time and are under different management regimes and all this. And this was a rule of thumb, I guess you could call it. But it had so much backing from the scientific community that when we put this out and went to the ASMFC to get them to amend the Menhaden plan, and they were considering ecological reference points, we got 117 fishery scientists to sign a letter supporting it. There were over 100 organizations, and 120,000 members of the public endorsed it, and there was probably 10 supporting the other options. Unfortunately, it didn't pass by one vote. And so what happened was that they decided that they wanted their own on-staff scientists to come up with reference points. And they did. And they're not as conservative as we wanted, but they are based primarily on striped bass, making a model that links Menhaden with striped bass and its population abundance and how much you can take, which is a big step forward, a huge step forward, really. Maybe we'll get to that 75% in future, but that was a big, I think, a big win. And there's been progress made throughout the councils in this same vein, to the point where unmanaged forage fish, ones that have not developed fisheries for yet, have been put off limits. They can't be fished until we assess what that impact might have on predators. So that's been very successful. And I think you can see in each of these instances, it's not just identifying a problem, but it's finding a solution and finding a pathway to that solution. And we only get involved in issues where we see that there will be a broader benefit than just for that particular fish or just that particular region or that particular group of fishermen. It really has to have some kind of national benefit or implications. Now, future issues, stories that have yet to be written. When I studied wildlife management at UNH, the key concept was carrying capacity. And that is the population size an animal's habitat is capable of supporting without harming that animal, associated species, or its habitat environment. And curiously, I've always found it curious that humans really do not think that this biologically sound concept applies to them, but it does. And you know, we're not fighting, you know, we're not trying to control population. You know, these things are a given, they're happening. And the demand for seafood is growing. And I don't know that that can be stopped, but we have to decide how we're going to deal with that. We're going to have to deal with it in a reasonable way. We look at it as protecting wild oceans, and while feeding the world. It's not an easy issue, farming at sea. And I'm talking about here more about open ocean systems for finfish farming, whether it's salmon farming or other kinds of farming. They talk about in pens out in the ocean, not the mariculture that goes on the shore, or the mussels, or those kind of things. They have a lot less concerns. It's the open ocean offshore aquaculture that is the big concern. And as you can see, aquaculture has surpassed wild capture fisheries in recent years in production of seafood. And most of this is going on in other countries, not in the US. Ours is pretty much of a fledgling industry, but the US is really champing at the bit to try to expand ours for both domestic consumption and export, and to get into that market. As you can see, we sort of hit the ceiling at the beginning of the end of the last century in terms of what we could take out of the ocean from wild capture fisheries. So the difference is being made up with agriculture. And I would like to give a disclaimer here that my opinions about fish farming are my opinions. They're not necessarily wild oceans. I think we're still developing a position on this, and I think we want it to be, just like we've always done it in the past, a well thought out and well researched thing that might allow some of this to continue, but to do it in a way that's going to be ecologically safe. But my kind of position is summed up, you know, the song by Steppenwolf, like a true nature's child, fish were born to be wild. Farmed fish are really creatures of science, not of nature. The science of breeding and raising ocean fish in captivity, it changes the fish in their environment and their relationship, our relationship with both. You know, we've known for quite a while that a population of 8 billion and maybe 10 billion in the next 30 years cannot be supported by wild fisheries. And we know the government is really pushing that. Jumping ahead there. Really pushing that aggressively, actually. But it's the Magnuson Act that's really holding things back offshore, because we don't know if farming fish is actually fishing, which would then be regulated under that act, and you're going to have to go through all the councils. And a lot of commercial and recreational fishermen are not too keen on letting offshore aquaculture expand in areas where they fish. Some of the problems that, I think it's, if sea farming is the answer to our problems, you know, it becomes, what is the question? And I think the questions are, how do we get the ocean to produce as much food as we can? You know, farming the sea as we farm the land. That's one question. Or is it, how do you farm the sea in ways that preserve wild fisheries and wild oceans? And we have to recognize there are problems associated with farming marine finfish in open systems, that they are well documented. We have pollution from chemicals, antibiotics, and nutrients, feces. There's disease outbreaks that spread in nearby waters, increased harvest of wild forage fish to feed carnivorous farmed fish, escapement of genetically modified fish into the wild gene pool, and loss of coastal habitat and fishing grounds. All these things have to be taken account of. And does it mean that we shouldn't, am I saying we shouldn't farm fish at sea? Maybe, maybe not. I think it's a matter of how we do it and on what scale. I don't believe that it's necessarily going to save all of our wild fisheries, that therefore it's going to take all this pressure off them. I think all technologies are really made to serve human needs, and those needs will be what are prioritized above others. So I think we really need to make sure that fish farming is done at in a way, at a scale that protects wild fisheries, protects the environment around those pens. And by scale, I mean, you can't do something like that on a really large industrialized scale without having enormous problems and enormous effects on everything else. And that, I think, is definitely something we should not do. Small localized farming is something that can be done. So anyway, that's obviously something for discussion and debate. Everybody has very strong feelings about that. And as I said, Wild Oceans is working that through. And I think when we come up with a position on that, I think it will be a well thought out and well researched one that will, I think, allow farming, but in a way that is going to protect the wild oceans and fishing. Now, the other big issue, New England coastal waters warming more than anywhere else in the U.S. Now, while some in the public arena are still denying that this is happening or wrangling over who's responsible, in the fisheries world, whether you're talking about fishery managers, policymakers, fishermen, there's really not any debate. They see it happening. They see the effects of warming waters on the fish that they're after, on their fisheries. And they're worried about how it will affect the future of fishing, both in localized areas and in general. And our position is we have to look at, we are not the ones who are going to stop climate change, if anyone is. We are not the ones who are going to do that. And we are not going to really argue over who's responsible. If something's happening, you want to deal with its effects, and that's on the fisheries. So we are focused on adapting the fishery management system to better understand what's happening in the ocean, how it's affecting stocks. We're seeing predators and prey move northward in this hemisphere, southward in the southern hemisphere, and not at the same rates. And we're seeing fish move offshore looking for cooler waters, and their food is not moving in the same place at the same time. So all these things are a problem. We're seeing some young fish, some young salmon starve because the zooplankton are not where they are when they move out into cooler waters. We're seeing a lot of these things, and we have to really figure out how do we use this information in our stock assessments so we know whether really the stock is increasing or decreasing and not just moving. We need to, well, there's a number of policy things that need to be done. We need to implement precautionary fishing limits. We've been pushing for precautionary approach for a long time, but here it's really in stark relief because in a warming ocean, it's even more important because the margin for error is much thinner when you don't quite fully understand exactly what's going on in the system. You could continue to fish at those heavy levels in that area and totally extirpate that stock. And even if you have another portion of that stock has moved to somewhere else, the fishermen, in many cases, can't move. They're not all distant water fishermen. They're not all migratory fishermen. A lot of local fishermen depend on what's off their shore. And you have to understand those things and be conservative in order to protect them. You have to monitor these changes, include the information in your stock assessments, accelerate the move into ecosystem-based management, going even faster than we have. We have fishery ecosystem plans that we've set up in each region that are doing things like building scenario building. Well, if this is happening, what will we do? If this is happening, what will we do? How will the industry adapt? How will the science adapt? How will our management regulations adapt? This is all very new stuff, and we're having to do it rather quickly. But as you see, I think it's the case everywhere. It's changing much faster than people had really expected that it was going to. And it's just time for people to stop arguing about who's responsible and whether it's real or not. It's real. And I think fishermen really need our help in in trying to understand exactly the impacts it's having on the ecosystem and on the fisheries, and I think for protecting all the life in the ocean. But again, it's a huge, huge problem, bigger than any of us, bigger than any organization. If an organization tells you they're fighting climate change, I would ask, what are you doing to stop that? The whole world's trying to do that and not having much luck. We've got to figure out how we're going to adapt in a way that's going to protect the things that are important to us. And the third thing is very much different. It's returning full circle. Remember this kid. I love this quote by Andrew Downing. "A wise old mother is nature, she guideth her children's feet." And recent research has shown a collapse, which we usually use in terms of fish stocks, in children's engagement with nature. And according to one study, in a single generation, the proportion of kids that regularly play in wild places fell from more than half to less than 1 in 10. And removal of children from the natural world, from wild rivers, from wild streams, wild oceans, is, I believe, an environmental crisis. Without that connection, which I think is as vital as any other in the chain of life, the whole thing could start to unravel. One advocate points out, and correctly I think by my own experience, that most of the people he knows who fight for nature are people who spent their childhoods immersed in it. And by directly engaging with the natural world, whether it's fishing, swimming, diving, surfing, sailing, exploring, we learn to appreciate in a way that no amount of book learning or visits to aquariums or virtual classrooms can replace. And without that experience, we are far less likely to take up the good fight to preserve it as adults. As each generation grows more and more apart from nature, our memory of the good old days dissolves like a fading photograph. And tomorrow's students of the ocean will be judging the quality of fishing against an ever-diminishing standard. How the Leopold, again, he once lamented that perhaps our grandsons, having never seen a wild river, will never miss the chance to set a canoe in singing waters. And that, I think, is a real danger. If the kids don't know what they're missing, they aren't going to miss it, they aren't going to fight for it. And of course, there can be purely rational environmentalists. You don't have to go to the Great Barrier Reef to understand its value and its importance. But on the other hand, this separation from nature, and David Western sort of alluded to it in the beginning of thinking of nature as something undisturbed by humans, and that we can set things away in parks and protect them and keep people out, and nature spared is nature saved, or that kind of thing. That's sort of an eco-modernist approach. I think that's a really dangerous approach. I think the coexistence, I think we are meant to coexist with nature, and in an artful coexistence lies its salvation. And there are many ways to interact with the ocean. Fishing is just one of them. But I think as long as people do, and we are more likely to appreciate it and fight to hold on to it, to much of that natural world as we can. So we will continue to face threats to the oceans and fishing, maybe more serious than we've ever faced before. And this is something I wrote in my farewell editorial when I retired, summing up. It's, and I was asked, how will we fare in the future? And I alluded to Somerset Maugham again. He said, it wasn't until late in life that I discovered how easy to say, I don't know. But I do know we will face them, that we must face them, and we must do it relentlessly. And this is something I've had on my desk for decades, this quote from Captain Bill McDonald of the Texas Rangers to inspire me, that no man in the wrong can stand up against a fellow that's in the right and keeps on a-coming. And I always thought of that as sort of the wild ocean's way of doing things, that we set our mind on a goal and we keep our eye on the prize and we keep going, and if we have to go this way to get there like that, we end up getting there, and I think we'll continue to take that approach. So anyway, I don't know how much time I took, or, 6:30. I think unless you're really starving, we can do some questions. I'm sorry I went a little bit over there.
That's right. Let's see.
You had a wonderful beginning to your life, and we all hope that your forefathers can do what your father did for you. But also a great call for good education. You have educational programs going, you have support educational institutions. What is being done for what we need in the educational field?
Okay. Yeah, Wild Oceans is a small. Excuse me. Wild Oceans, by design, is a small, lean, mean organization. We don't have a lot of resources for those kind of educational programs, although we have spoken to, Pam Lyons-Groman, our executive director, has spoken to children's groups, and I've spoken at some high schools over the years. And we do have a program down in Florida where we support scholarships for college students who are studying, actually writing dissertations on some of the forage fish issues in Florida. And that's working with some other organizations down there. So we've done that in a limited way. But when I've spoken to high school kids, I really have. And actually, when I went to one of them, they said, these kids think that everything is STEM. You know, that the whole future is science and technology. And, you know, I'm old school. I realize that's true in a lot of sense. And kids need to understand that. But I wanted to, they said, please impress upon them the importance of the liberal arts and the humanities, too. And that's, you know, I made that point early on, that having that balance is really valuable. It was very valuable for me, and I think throughout all this stuff I've done, you know, it's not just enough to understand the science. You have to really know people, what motivates them. You have to really know how to communicate. There's a whole bunch of other things that go into it. And science doesn't just give you the answers. The humanities really teaches you to, like, put this in the context of what really is going to benefit us and our place in nature. But there are organizations that do fill that gap with educational programs, and we certainly would want to help advertise those kind of efforts.
One more question.
One in the back.
Thank you, Ken. The question's about cod, and is cod very slow to come back to the Northeast? That's the perception, and why is that?
Yeah, actually I skipped over that in my effort to be a little bit shorter. Yeah, in the, I think there's 13 groundfish species that were rebuilt. Cod was not one of them. And there are a lot of, there's a lot of theories about why that's the case. I think they were fished so low that I think they're having a hard time regaining their place in the ecosystem. You know, they all have a niche. You know, when you go below this critical mass, other species occupy that niche. There's also, I think, some of the nearshore, I think in Maine, some of the nearshore stocks, because there are a lot of substocks to the Atlantic cod that have not come back at all. And the question is, have they just been totally extirpated? They just were taken to such a low point that they cannot come back. That doesn't mean they're extinct, but it just means they're not going to rebuild the historic levels. And then there's some of the other issues with warming waters, that young cod are not finding the things that they need to grow and mature in the numbers that they used to because of change. They have to go up farther offshore to find cooler waters, and they don't find the same food there. But there's a lot of speculation. But yeah, the Atlantic cod is still something that may not ever return to what it was 50 years ago. And that's a crime. And I think it's a warning sign too, that you can overfish a species, and with striped bass we found that you can rebuild that species. But on the other hand, there's such a thing as ecosystem overfishing. And if you change the system enough by overfishing that species, it may not be able to come back because things have changed. their spot in the ecosystem has been replaced by other fish that they therefore can't compete with. And so it's, yeah, and that's, I think it's more of a warning that we don't want to ever again let anything get that low.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We can't thank you enough. I don't think it's an overstatement to say that this gentleman is a national treasure for marine conservation. Certainly that's the impression I have after his talk. Really wonderful. Now, I would like to take a moment to mention next week's program. We have a most unusual opportunity in hearing Dr. Cyan Proctor, who is a civilian astronaut. She is, and a science educator. She is one of 4 people who formed an all-civilian crew in a space launch that took place earlier this year. She's going to be thrilling, especially for our younger audience. So I hope those of you who have younger people who might be interested in space exploration will make a special effort to bring them out. So we look forward to seeing you next week. And now it's over to the barbecue. Thank you.